"Hey there, night owl." Or perhaps it's nearly morning for you. Either way, you've found your way here, which means it's time to put on your softest blanket. Maybe turn on that little white noise machine, the one that sounds like gentle wind through pine trees, and settle in for a slow, dry, historical wander through time. Tonight, we begin with something chilly. Not the thrilling kind of chilly that involves dramatic avalanches or heroic dogsled rescues. No. This is a much more ordinary kind of cold. The kind that seeps into your socks. The kind that makes your teeth ache a little when you breathe. The kind that made survival in the Wild West feel like an exhausting, mildly damp board game with questionable rules and no real winner. So go ahead. Close your eyes if you'd like, or keep them open and stare at the ceiling in that way people do when they're listening to something comfortably dull. Either way, let's begin. You are standing in the doorway of your modest homestead. The year is 1887, and the first snow has just started to fall. Not the nice kind of snow that lands softly on a quiet field. This is the other kind. The kind that whips sideways and makes your chickens run in anxious zigzags. The kind that gets into your shirt even when you're sure it's buttoned all the way up. Your boots are already wet. The house behind you creaks with every gust. It's made of logs, thick, uneven, slightly bowed from years of seasonal tantrums. But it's home, a low-sloped roof to help the snow slide off, except when it doesn't. Then you just poke it with a stick from inside until a soft, snowy avalanche thumps down beside the porch. Your wife, Margaret, is inside, layering quilts onto the children, like they're bread loaves at a winter bake sale. The baby is already bundled in 3 scarves and is making suspicious, gurgling sounds, possibly communicating with the firewood pile. You've spent the last 3 weeks chopping trees and stacking cords of wood. It's a deeply repetitive task, chopping wood. You swing the axe. The log splits. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it stares at you stubbornly, like it knows how cold your hands are. You don't argue. You just swing again. There's a small shed behind the cabin. Inside are more logs, some dried beans, and a barrel full of things you're not emotionally ready to inventory. You tell yourself you'll clean it next spring. You won't. The stove inside the cabin is the most important piece of furniture. Not the table where you eat, or the chair that everyone fights over, or even the bed that smells faintly of hay and last month's wet socks. No, it's the stove. A black cast-iron, soot-dusted box that hums and clicks like it's trying to sing. It's not elegant. It's not new. It's slightly tilted and makes odd popping noises around midnight, but it gives off heat. And in this world, that's all that matters. The children have developed a kind of rotational schedule. One naps beside the stove, one reads a book about prairie birds, and the third pokes the fire with a stick until you confiscate the stick. Then they repeat. You all wear everything you own, layer upon layer of wool, flannel, cotton, and the occasional reconfigured horse blanket. It's not fashionable. It's not flattering. It's not clean. But it works mostly. You've learned to move slowly so you don't generate unnecessary breeze. Margaret made mittens out of an old quilt. You suspect the quilt was still in use when she cut it up, but you've learned not to ask. Your own mittens were once part of a coat that belonged to someone named Jedediah. You never met him. The coat came with the cabin. No one talks about it. Outside, the snow deepens. The wind moans through the gaps in the wall, a low, thoughtful kind of moan, like the house is remembering something but vague. You stuff more moss into the cracks. It falls out again. You repeat the process. It's a kind of relationship now. The floor is cold, even with the rugs. Not fancy rugs, just braided things made from torn shirts and old seed bags. Each one tells a story if you know how to read patterns of dirt. You sleep in shifts, not for safety, but because it's the only way to rotate near the stove. The warmest spot goes to whoever's currently winning at not complaining. You're losing. At night, the stars are brutally clear. The kind of clarity that makes you question your place in the cosmos. You step outside to use the outhouse, a cheerful name for a wooden box with a door that doesn't close, and the sky stares back. You wonder if it's judging your choice of socks. It probably is. You return inside, quickly stomping snow from your boots, which earns you a look from Margaret. It's the look of someone calculating how much wood you'll need to chop tomorrow. You go ahead and apologize, even though you're not entirely sure why. It's safer that way. And as the cabin creaks and the wind presses against the windows like a neighbor with bad news, you lie under 3 quilts, 1 blanket, and what might be part of a saddlebag, and you drift, not into sleep exactly, more like into a warm fog of semi-consciousness where the cold can't quite reach, and everything smells faintly of stew. And that, friend, is how the long winter begins. By the 2nd week of December, which you only know because Margaret marked it with a piece of charcoal on the inside of the pantry door, the snow has settled into a kind of quiet tyranny. It no longer surprises anyone. It just exists, a permanent participant in every conversation, every chore, every mildly damp sock. The children have stopped asking when it will end. You suspect they believe this is simply how the world is now. White cold and full of inconvenient mittens. The stove remains your most reliable companion. You talk to it more than is socially acceptable, offering it compliments when it burns well, and mild threats when it smokes. Margaret says that's odd behavior, but then again, she hums to the dish rag, so you're even. The days blend together like unseasoned porridge. Warm, vaguely comforting, and entirely without punctuation. But one thing becomes painfully clear. Staying dry is no longer a luxury. It's a science, a strategy, a borderline religion. Every item of clothing you own now has a designated drying location. Socks, for instance, are awarded front row seats by the stove. They drape over chairs, perch on broom handles, and sometimes hang from a piece of string you've rigged across the kitchen like a sad, woolly clothesline. Shirts are allowed further back near the wall where they can toast gently without risking combustion. Underwear receives the top shelf both for safety and modesty. The children have been taught a strict rotation schedule. No one is allowed to monopolize the warmest drying spot for more than one meal's duration. Violations are met with sighs, stern glances, and once the temporary revocation of stick-poking privileges. Discipline is important in these matters. Laundry, in the traditional sense, is now a twice-monthly ordeal. It takes place in a large wooden tub near the fire. Margaret adds hot water with the precision of a chemist, carefully avoiding boiling anything living or previously knit. The clothes are stirred, not so much washed as interrogated. Then they are wrung out with a technique that involves two people, one rolling pin, and the kind of teamwork usually reserved for barn raisings. After that, they're draped across every available surface, like theatrical ghosts waiting for their cue. There is a smell, of course, not unpleasant, just very specific. A blend of damp wool wood smoke, boiled soap, and something vaguely medicinal that no one remembers adding. It lingers in your nose, in your hair, and on your dreams. You once dreamt of a conversation between two socks discussing their drying options. One was arrogant, the other was damp. You woke up feeling slightly ashamed. Outside, the snow continues to fall in layers. You no longer measure it in inches, but in fence posts. The north fence has disappeared. The woodpile has developed its own ecosystem. You swear you saw a squirrel wearing a scarf, though it may have just been an unusually shaped pine cone. No one wants to go out unless absolutely necessary. So naturally, you ran out of lard. This leads to what will later be known as the Tuesday expedition. You bundle yourself in every warm item available, including a quilt, a scarf Margaret claims was once a curtain, and a pair of gloves made from a repurposed felt hat. You resemble a moderately intelligent hay bale. The general store is 3 miles away. You walk there with purpose, stopping only once to rescue your hat from a gust of wind that appears to have personal opinions about headwear. The store is warmer than expected. The owner, a man named Calvin, who speaks exclusively in 2-word phrases, nods at you in the universal language of winter exhaustion. You nod back. No words are exchanged. You purchase lard, more matches, a tin of dubious-looking molasses, and something labeled medicinal spirits that you plan to investigate further when the children are asleep. The walk home is longer, mostly because of the wind, and a minor disagreement with your left boot, which has begun to leak somewhere around the toe. You arrive just in time to catch Margaret attempting to reheat stew with nothing but the residual heat from a boiled sock. She hands you a bowl. You hand her the lard. It is by local standards a romantic moment. That evening, you sit by the stove, slowly peeling off layers like a tired onion. The children are playing a game that involves pretending to be warm. You pretend to believe them. Outside, the snow taps gently on the window, not in menace, but as a reminder. It isn't done with you yet. It's never really done. You hang your boot near the stove and hope it learns its lesson. You stare at the flames. They crackle politely. Somewhere behind you, Margaret hums. You don't recognize the tune. It might be the dish rag song. You close your eyes. Tomorrow, someone will have to go to the well. And there's talk of a blizzard. But for now, by morning, the boot has dried into a shape not entirely familiar. It curls slightly at the toe now, as if it's questioning your life choices. You put it on anyway, mostly because you only have the one pair, and partially because arguing with footwear is considered a bad omen this early in the winter. Outside, the wind has shifted from an accusatory whistle to something more philosophical, the kind of wind that mutters to itself while rearranging your firewood. The sky is gray, not the soft blanket gray of a sleepy snow day, but the heavy-lidded stare of a ski that's planning something unpleasant and wants you to know it. The well, unfortunately, still exists. It's a perfectly functional well, dug by someone long gone and maintained with the kind of passive resentment that characterizes most winter chores. It's situated inconveniently at the far end of the yard near the barn, which means every trip is a journey of self-reflection and frostbite. You make the trek, each step a careful negotiation between dignity and slipperiness. The snow is deeper than yesterday, which is deeply unhelpful. Your legs vanish with every step, and by the time you reach the well, you resemble a confused goose trapped in a snow globe. The well is covered by a heavy wooden lid that requires 2 hands and a strong argument to lift. You open it slowly, peering into the darkness like it might bite. The bucket is there frozen slightly to the rope because of course it is. You twist it free with the grace of someone trying not to cuss loud enough for the chickens to hear. Lowering the bucket is its own sport. The rope groans, the pulley creaks, and the water below echoes in a way that reminds you of bad decisions. You fill it as best you can, winch it back up, and carefully carry it back to the house with all the reverence of someone transporting sacred soup. By the time you return, your fingers have forgotten how to be fingers, and your eyebrows are gathering frost like overachieving caterpillars. Margaret takes the bucket without comment, placing it near the fire so it can become something vaguely pourable again. You sit by the stove, holding your hands out to the heat, as if you're offering them an apology. The children are playing quietly, which means either something is broken or something is about to be. You don't ask. You value peace more than you value furniture. The morning drifts along. Margaret sets the day's priorities. Laundry rotation, stew reheating, boot drying, and the always popular chore of sweeping melted snow back outside before it becomes a new household feature. You are assigned the woodpile. Again. The woodpile has taken on a sort of mythic quality. It looms at the edge of the yard, partially buried, slightly slanted, and always judging. Chopping wood in winter is not a glamorous task. Your breath fogs in front of you, like a ghost with opinions, and your gloves, already stiff from yesterday's water-hauling expedition, offer very little in the way of dexterity. The axe is cold, the wood is stubborn, and your knees keep making a sound that could be described as disappointed accordion. But you swing, you split, you stack, and you repeat. By midday, you've chopped enough to refill the corner bin beside the stove, which Margaret greets with a nod that in your marriage qualifies as both praise and emotional intimacy. The stew is ready again, which is to say, it has reached a state of warmth slightly above room temperature and below enthusiastic. You eat it slowly, savoring each spoonful like it's a rare delicacy, which it sort of is, considering the carrots are from last season and the meat might still be under negotiation with the family dog. After lunch, there's a short discussion about the barn roof. It's sagging more than usual, and the last snowstorm didn't help. You volunteer to inspect it not out of bravery, but because it might be slightly warmer, then reorganizing the damp boots again. The barn, bless its creaky soul, has been standing for 32 winters. It leans slightly, groans like an old man getting out of a chair, and smells comfortingly of hay animals and the vague memory of autumn. The roof is indeed sagging. You climb up slowly, carefully, like someone who understands gravity and fears litigation from their own bones. Once on the roof, you begin clearing snow, tossing it to the side, with the practiced indifference of a person who's already done this 7 times this week. It's a slow, cold, mildly existential task. You pause occasionally to stretch your back and wonder if anyone will ever invent a season that doesn't involve shovels. Below the yard is quiet. The wind has calmed for now. Margaret is hanging socks near the stove again. The children are playing some version of tag that appears to involve one of them pretending to be a blizzard. The chickens, who know better, stay near the barn. You finish the roof and climb down, boots crunching on the packed snow. Fingers, numb arms sore. Face, wind-burned into a semi-permanent frown. You return to the house to find the stew pot boiling over slightly, and Margaret rescuing it with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this so often she could do it in her sleep. The baby is asleep under the table, which is not ideal, but also not uncommon. You remove your boots, hang your coat, and sink into the bench by the fire. The warmth seeps in slowly, melting the cold from your clothes, your hair, your thoughts. The sky outside is dimming now, turning that early shade of not quite night, not quite day, that winter afternoons specialize in. You think about the water in the bucket, about the snow on the barn, about the smell of the stew and the angle of the wind, and whether the window latch is holding. You think about tomorrow and the possibility of another storm, and what you might do if the boot curls any further. The window latch did not, in fact, hold. Sometime during the night, while the house creaked in its sleep, and the fire grumbled softly to itself, the latch gave up whatever feeble resistance it had been offering, and allowed a gentle draft of Arctic enthusiasm to swirl in. By morning, the curtain was stiff. The windowsill had gathered a neat pile of powdery defiance, and the bench beside it was now an honorary member of the snowbank outside. No one screamed. That was the rule. Winter was not to be met with alarm. It was to be met with sighs, quiet muttering, and slow, methodical rearrangement of furniture. Margaret, to her credit, simply moved the curtain aside, observed the new interior, frost layer, and fetched the patching blanket. The patching blanket was a repurposed quilt, once colorful, now faded into the dull hues of resigned utility. It had served as a bed cover, a tablecloth, a picnic blanket, and once briefly as a sled. Today, it became a new window. You tacked it into place with the same nails used every winter nails that lived in a jam jar labeled useful things, and had developed their own personalities over time. One was slightly bent, and therefore only trustworthy for holding up the bottom corner. Another was entirely reliable, but smug about it. Outside, the wind had adopted a more enthusiastic tone. It wasn't angry exactly, more like performative, as if it had waited all night to show off its new choreography and was now pirouetting through the yard with every loose piece of straw, forgotten mitten, and moderately offended chicken it could find. The snow drifted in deliberate swirls, stacking up against the barn, the shed, the outhouse, and most unhelpfully, the front door. The door refused to open more than a few inches before crunching into resistance. Not heavy resistance, just stubborn. Like a neighbor leaning casually against it and pretending they had no idea you were trying to get out. You gave it a nudge. It nudged back. You considered the back door. The back door, located on the leeward side of the house, had fewer ambitions. It opened without complaint, though it did release a small pile of accumulated snow into your boot. You took that as a greeting. Navigating the yard became its own adventure. Every step required negotiation. You moved through the drifts like a very polite mole, gently parting the snow with your knees and offering it the opportunity to move aside. It declined. By the time you reached the barn, you were half covered, half frozen, and mildly contemplative. The barn, bless it, remained a sanctuary. Inside, the animals shuffled and snorted and looked at you with a mixture of boredom and blame. You nodded to them all as was custom and began the process of feeding checking hooves and reinforcing the hay bale wall against the draft coming from the back corner. The goat who had declared herself emotionally superior to winter refused to move from her perch near the oil lamp. You respected that. The chickens were fine. A little confused by the change in indoor lighting, but fine. You checked the rafters, made sure the snow wasn't gathering too enthusiastically above the beam that always threatened to bend, and gave the cat a firm reminder that mice were not optional this season. She ignored you with professional disdain. Back at the house, the children had constructed a game called Snow Fort inside, which was exactly as worrying as it sounded. It involved moving every pillow in the house, several pieces of firewood, and the small rug from under the table. Margaret was pretending not to notice. She was stirring the stew again this time, with a new addition, something she only identified as root. Maybe turnip, maybe not. The smell was comforting, if ambiguous. You set the firewood down beside the stove, now an uneven but earnest pyramid, and removed your boots with the sigh of someone who has walked uphill both ways through a metaphor. The warmth crept back into your toes slowly, like it had to be convinced. Outside, the wind howled, not loudly, but with intention. It had become philosophical again, moaning in long, thoughtful tones that made the shutters rattle and the dog whimper in his sleep. You sat at the table with a mug of something hot. It may have been tea. It may have been broth. It may have been melted snow with ambitions. It didn't matter. It was warm. That was the point. Margaret handed you a pair of socks to hang. They were not dry. They were not particularly clean, but they were damp in a hopeful way, which meant progress. You strung them up beside the others, forming what had become your winter garland, a sagging line of laundry dreams and foot-shaped optimism. The children ran past again, shrieking with joy, or possibly protest. It was difficult to tell. The snow fort had gained an extension. You weren't sure who approved the building permit. The stew was ready, which is to say it had been boiling for just long enough that everyone stopped asking when it would be. You ate it in silence, the good kind of silence, the kind filled with the sound of wind and chewing, and the occasional clink of spoon against enamelware. Afterward, you added more wood to the fire. The log crackled like it had been waiting to perform. You settled into your chair. Margaret read from the old almanac, the pages slightly warped, the predictions wildly inaccurate, but charming. You listened. The room grew warmer. The snow continued to fall. The wind pressed against the walls, testing them gently, like a cat checking for weak spots in a fence. You closed your eyes, briefly, not sleeping, just resting, just waiting. Because tomorrow would be colder. You could feel it in your boots, the ones still curled by the stove, whispering about something not quite legible, just the soft, leathery crinkle of weathered soles drying in a half circle beside the fire, toe to toe, in what appeared to be some kind of quiet conference. You eyed them with a mixture of suspicion and fatigue, unsure if they were conspiring against your arches or merely complaining about snow. Either way, they weren't ready. The fire popped once decisively, as if to signal the end of boot debate. The window blanket was still holding. Only a faint line of frost had crept in overnight, tracing a delicate pattern across the sill, like winter had been doodling in its sleep. You reached out and touched it with one finger. It felt like glass, and old secrets. Outside, the snow had changed. Not heavier, not deeper, just different, more determined. It didn't fall so much as settle, like it already knew where it was going. The wind had eased slightly, but only to catch its breath. It would be back. Margaret was already up, sitting at the table with a bowl of something grayish. It steamed politely. You assumed it was breakfast? It might also have been leftover stew, or boiled oats, or simply warm hope in a bowl. You sat beside her without speaking. Words were unnecessary at this hour. You simply nodded at the stove and received a slow blink in return. Mutual acknowledgement of survival. The children, still asleep beneath their quilt pile, resembled a single multi-limbed creature snoring in shifts. One sock dangled off the edge like a flag of surrender. You sipped your breakfast slowly, letting the heat find the corners of your throat. Then you remembered the kindling box was low. That was a problem. Not a dramatic one, not yet, but kindling was the beginning of everything. Without it, the stove sulked. Without the stove, the water stayed solid, and the stew stayed theoretical. You finished your bowl and stood already dreading the task. The kindling box lived on the porch, which was for legal purposes outside. You layered up again. Shirt, sweater, coat, scarf, second scarf for moral support, and mittens. The good mittens had gone missing sometime last week, possibly, claimed by the laundry, possibly staging a protest. You wore the backup pair, which smelled vaguely of onions, and were slightly different lengths. You opened the back door, where the snow had behaved slightly better. The porch groaned under your weight, not because it was weak, but because it wanted you to know it was working hard. You nodded to it. The kindling box was half buried. You dug with your hands, fingers curled like claws, scooping away the crust of last night's blizzard, until the lid reappeared. You lifted it, slowly, carefully, like unveiling a delicate secret. Inside, blessedly, were sticks. Not many, not dry, but present. You filled your arms and returned indoors, trailing a cloud of snowflakes and frozen optimism behind you. Margaret didn't look up, but she handed you a towel. This was her way of saying thank you. The fire accepted the offering of kindling with a few crackles and one soft wheeze. It caught eventually. Everything did if you gave it time. The children stirred beneath the quilt creature, heads emerging like prairie dogs at the scent of toast. There was no toast, but the illusion of warmth did strange things to memory. By mid-morning, the stew had been reheated for the third time and officially upgraded to dinner, if no one complains. The children resumed their campaign of interior snow fortification. The rug was now suspended from 2 chairs and declared a roof. You were assigned the task of wood splitting. Again. The axe waited outside, blade buried in a log that refused to split on principle. You retrieved it with numb fingers, muttering apologies to your joints as you walked back toward the woodpile, which was now a small hill of frozen intentions. The first swing missed slightly. The second lodged in the log with the kind of stubborn thunk that made your elbows wince. You worked slowly. The cold did strange things to your limbs. Time stretched and curled and folded in on itself like overboiled wool. After a while, the logs stopped resisting. You carried them inside, 2 at a time, boots squeaking, breath fogging the kind of work that didn't require thought, just endurance. Margaret was mending something by the fire. A mitten, maybe, or a shirt sleeve, or one of the many indistinct fabric creatures that the children had begun to produce during long afternoons. You didn't ask. You just placed the wood by the stove and accepted another mug of whatever was warm. Outside, the light was beginning to fade again. It wasn't late, just winter. Shadows arrived early, accompanied by wind, and that particular hush that made you think the sky was holding its breath. You checked the window blanket again, still secure, still fluttering slightly with each gust. The boots were dry now. One had slumped slightly. The other remained upright, proud, or perhaps defiant. You considered putting them on, but your feet, currently wrapped in 2 pairs of socks and a section of last year's flannel shirt, objected. Margaret said something about the well. You nodded. Tomorrow. Maybe. The stew was bubbling again. The children were quiet, finally worn down by imaginary blizzards and pillow negotiations. The cat had taken up residence in the kindling box, which was now empty and full at the same time. You reached for another log, added it to the fire, and listened. The crackle, the sigh of heat, the hum of survival. It was going to snow again tonight. You could feel it in the wallboards. You could hear it in the space between gusts. You leaned back in your chair, the firelight flickering across the ceiling in soft waves. The boots didn't whisper now. They simply waited, because soon it would be time to move again, not with speed or urgency, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm that winter demanded. Movement was rationed now, like sugar or good boots. You didn't rush through chores. You coaxed them along one cautious footstep at a time, like talking a skittish horse across a frozen creek. The fire had burned low, as it always did, by mid-evening, when the stew was a memory, and the children had dissolved back into their quilt pile like sleepy moths hiding in linen. The cat snored quietly from inside the kindling box, having refused every invitation to move to a more appropriate location. Margaret had gone to bed already, her chair now folded neatly with her shawl draped across the back like a flag of domestic diplomacy. The wind had picked up again, tapping at the window, like a friend with bad news. It wasn't angry, but it was persistent, a steady knock, knock, knock that made the shutters quiver and the floorboards shift in reply. You were on stove duty tonight, which sounded like an honor, but was really just a polite way of saying you drew the short straw. Every few hours, the fire would need more wood. Not much. Just a log or two to keep the frost from creeping back in, like an uninvited guest. Let it go out entirely, and the entire next day would be dedicated to the humble art of trying not to freeze to death while pretending not to mind. You sat in your chair, which had finally accepted your shape after weeks of negotiation, and stared at the stove like it might blink first. It didn't. The fire inside cast lazy shadows across the floor, licking the walls with soft light that made everything seem warmer than it was. You pulled the blanket tighter around your shoulders, a quilt made from old shirts, frayed curtains, and something Margaret once claimed was a petticoat, but refused to elaborate. The logs beside you were already sorted by size, small, medium, unreasonably optimistic. You added a medium one now, just enough to keep things humming. The door creaked open, accepted the offering, and sighed in reply. The room warmed slightly enough to make you reconsider your socks. You didn't remove them. That would have been madness. But you did wiggle your toes inside them, just to prove a point. Midnight arrived without ceremony. No clocks chimed. No owls hooted. Just the soft sound of the wind and the occasional complaint from the stove. You stood stretched and walked the perimeter of the room like a sentry on patrol. The window blanket was still in place. The back door latch had shifted again. Margaret had added a wedge to keep it from opening in the night, a clever trick involving a piece of firewood and a spoon. You adjusted it. You checked the pantry. Not for anything in particular, just to remind yourself it was there. The shelves were a patchwork of ambition and compromise. A few jars of preserved something, some beans, flour barely enough for 2 good loaves, or one very ambitious stew thickener. The molasses tin was there too, half full, and always slightly sticky. You closed the door and stepped back to the fire. The cat had shifted in the kindling box, now draped over the edge like a liquid blanket with whiskers. You reached down and scratched behind her ears. She purred, then bit you lightly as a reminder that comfort was conditional. You sat back down. Outside, the wind moaned again longer, this time the kind of sound that made the walls lean in slightly, as if trying to hear better. You pulled the blanket tighter. The fire popped, once startled by its own heat, and then returned to its steady murmur. Your eyes grew heavy, not from exhaustion exactly, but from warmth, from routine, from knowing that for this one moment, everything that needed doing had been done. You didn't sleep. That wasn't the agreement, but you drifted, eyes half open, ears tuned to the crackle of wood and the soft creak of a house holding its breath. Somewhere in the darkness, the wind changed direction. You felt it in the floorboards, the way they flexed slightly beneath your feet. The window curtain fluttered once, then stilled. The fire guttered, then flared a reminder that it was still listening. You stood again, more out of instinct than need, and added another log, small this time, just a whisper of warmth. The door hissed shut. The shadows danced. You walked to the window and peeked beneath the quilt. Snow. Of course. Not heavy, not light. Just there, stacking itself neatly on every surface like it had a list to complete. You closed the curtain. Behind you, the stove let out a long, contented sigh. You returned to your chair. The blanket fell back into place. The fire kept burning, and in the soft light of the room, with the cat in her box, and the wind still trying to find a weak spot in the wall, you waited. Because soon the hour would turn again, and the fire would need attention, just as you knew it would quietly, without drama, the way cold always sneaks back into a room after you've let yourself believe, however briefly, that you've beaten it. The fire had dipped low again, not out, not close, but enough that the warmth had stopped reaching the far corners of the room, enough that the floor beneath your socked feet started to feel less like wood and more like apology. You rubbed your hands together, stood slowly, the blanket clinging to your shoulders like a reluctant companion, and shuffled to the stove where the embers blinked up at you like sleepy eyes. The poker was where it always lived, beside the kindling box, currently cat-free for the first time in hours, and you took it in hand, jostling the ash with the soft care of someone checking on an old friend. The fire, to its credit, hadn't gone far. A quick prod, a bit of breath, and a careful tuck of kindling between the still glowing coals coaxed it back to life. It didn't roar. Roaring was a luxury of fireplaces in books. Your stove murmured instead, crackled politely, warmed with the grace of a companion who didn't want thanks. You added another log, medium-sized seasoned, just enough to burn without complaint, and closed the door gently. The stove grunted once, and then settled into a low, even warmth that promised to behave until breakfast. You poured water into the kettle from the pail by the door. The water was half frozen at the top, a crust of stubborn ice that cracked like thin glass when your ladle touched it. It clinked into the kettle, sloshed slightly, and settled. Soon it would boil. That was the hope. The window blanket had iced at the corners, the frost blooming out in delicate tendrils, each one a slow-motion testimony to the failure of insulation and the persistence of weather. You didn't disturb it. It was almost decorative. The kind of thing you might pretend was beautiful if your toes weren't considering mutiny. Behind you, the blanket fort rustled as one of the children stirred. A small head peeked out, eyes blinking in the half-dark. You held up a finger to your lips and pointed at the fire. They nodded, disappeared again beneath the folds. It wasn't time to rise yet. Not by the house clock, which didn't exist, or the sun, which hadn't arrived. You lived by stove hours now, measured in embers and log size, and the number of times you had to stir the coals before the room stopped feeling like the inside of a snowman. The kettle whined gently as it warmed. You poured a cup, held it in both hands, and let the steam wash over your face. It was bitter, weak tea made from dried leaves, and something Margaret insisted was mint, though it might have just been last year's garden trimmings. Still, it was hot, and hot was enough. You sat again, not to rest, but to wait. Morning had not arrived, but it was circling. The light outside was starting to shift just barely, just enough that you could see the outline of the snow against the barn, the faint glint of frost on the outhouse roof. It wouldn't be long now. Margaret would be up soon, followed by the children, then the day, then the chores, all of them familiar, all of them necessary. But for now, there was just you and the stove and the tea that tasted like regret and dried hay. You took another sip. The heat filled your chest. The blanket slipped from one shoulder. You didn't bother adjusting it. There was something to be said for asymmetry in winter. The floor creaked near the back door. Not an animal, not a gust of wind, just wood, stretching, remembering. The house did that sometimes made sounds that reminded you it was older than your habits, more seasoned than your patience. You reached down to rub your knee, which had started to ache in that familiar, low-throbbing way it always did after long hours near the cold floor. The doctor who visited town twice a month and mostly talked about potatoes had called it weather knee. You called it the reason you never sit cross-legged anymore. You stood again, poured a second cup, and added a splash of whatever remained in the molasses jar. The result was sweeter, vaguely medicinal, and thick enough to be mistaken for a snack. You sipped, stared at the stove, and wondered if the snow would let up today. Not end, of course. It never ended. But ease, maybe. Allow enough time to shovel the path to the shed, to check the henhouse, to air out the bedding if you were feeling ambitious. The cat returned tail high, walking with the confidence of a creature that had never once hauled water from a frozen well. She leapt into your lap without asking, turned twice, and settled. You made room. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, and sleep, her hair braided back with the kind of precision that only came from years of habit. She didn't speak, just nodded at the fire, the tea, the stove, the room. You nodded back. Mutual understanding. She stepped into the kitchen, her bare feet quiet against the wood, and began checking the stew pot, the water pail, the bread cloth. Her fingers moved with practiced calm, tucking, lifting, stirring. You didn't interrupt. She handed you a piece of yesterday's bread, firm at the edges, but still edible, especially when dipped in tea. You ate slowly. The sun, if it could be called that, finally crept above the horizon, sending a smear of pale gold across the wall beside the stove. The shadows shifted. The room brightened by degrees. The blanket fort rustled again. A voice mumbled something about breakfast. The kettle let out a triumphant hiss, as if it had just remembered its purpose. You looked at Margaret. She looked at the stove. And together, without speaking, you began the quiet, necessary process of preparing for a day that would soon demand your full attention, because once the kettle hissed its final note, and the room was flooded with that pale, reluctant kind of winter morning light, everything began moving again in its own quiet, mechanical rhythm. The children emerged from the quilt mountain with expressions halfway between curiosity and betrayal, blinking against the cold air like small mammals exiting hibernation, rubbing their eyes, tugging on mismatched socks, and immediately forming an unspoken alliance against whatever breakfast might not include sugar. Margaret handed each one a piece of bread without ceremony, and they accepted it with the silent reverence of people who had learned that protesting breakfast usually ended with extra chores. The fire was holding, which meant the kitchen could operate without gloves. For now, and the stew pot was being coaxed into usefulness once again, with a bit of water, a dash of something Margaret called seasoning that resembled grayish dust, and the remnants of last night's carrots, which had achieved the rare consistency of both soft and crunchy. You moved around the table, pulling out stools and brushing crumbs from surfaces that hadn't seen a clean cloth since the last time someone remembered where the clean cloths were kept. One of the children attempted to trade their crust for someone else's, a move swiftly vetoed by Margaret, with a single raised eyebrow and a noise somewhere between a hum and a threat. Breakfast seating was not officially assigned, but over time patterns had emerged. The youngest sat closest to the fire, a privilege granted to preserve small toes from turning into historical anecdotes. You sat at the end nearest the window, partly to keep an eye on the snow level against the sill, partly because the draft there kept your knees alert. Margaret stood, as she often did, her meal in hand, leaning lightly against the counter, as if sitting might invite too much rest. The bread, while plain, had been toasted slightly on the stove's edge, giving it a crispness that suggested intention. You dipped yours in your tea, letting it soften, and bit down slowly, the flavor a familiar mix of flour, wood smoke, and effort. One child asked what day it was. No one answered right away. Calendars were theoretical at best during deep winter. Days were marked by how many logs you burned, how many times you emptied the ash box, how many socks went missing in the laundry rotation, and returned weeks later with stories they refused to share. Margaret guessed Thursday. You said possibly Friday. The children voted for Tuesday on the grounds that Tuesday sounded less like a chore day. A compromise was reached. It was today. Outside, the wind had gone suspiciously quiet, the kind of quiet that never meant good news. You peered through a crack in the window quilt and saw a landscape of white soft and even unmarred by tracks or movement. The snow was high, but not dangerously so, unless you needed to get to the shed. You did. That's where the preserved root vegetables were sealed in straw and barrels, like time capsules from a more optimistic season. You finished your bread and stood collecting bowls and mugs in a tidy stack, handing them to Margaret, who rinsed them with snow melt, still warm, from the back of the stove. The children were already donning their outer layers, engaging in the daily performance art of winter dressing. Multiple shirts, one inside out, trousers over stockings that sagged like tired flags, mittens tied together with string threaded through coat sleeves, and the eternal debate over who got the scarf with the least mysterious stain. You located your boots near the stove where they had migrated during the night, like domestic animals drawn to heat. They were mostly dry, still slightly curled, but willing. You pulled them on with the sigh of someone preparing for polite confrontation. Your coat, the heavy one, with the patch on the elbow, and the smell of linseed oil went over your shoulders, like a curtain of intention. The hat, which had recently been borrowed and returned by the smallest child in the house, was now slightly smaller, possibly shrunken, possibly just smug. It sat on your head with the kind of commitment that only came from wool and passive resistance. Margaret handed you the shed key, a bent iron shape that had lived in the same drawer for 5 winters. You accepted it with the solemnity it deserved. One child offered to help. You declined, remembering last time. The snow was knee-deep before you cleared the porch, and by the time you reached the path to the shed, it had climbed past your thighs, not with urgency, but with the slow, inevitable determination of powdered time. You moved forward, step by step, like someone wading through memory. The shovel waited beside the door, loyal, splintered, and slightly crooked. You used it to push the drift aside, revealing the outline of the shed door, which resisted opening until you gave it a firm tug and a whispered apology. Inside, the air was still dense with the smell of straw and earth and faint vinegar. You lit the lantern on the hook, the flame flickering to life with a sound like someone clearing their throat. The shelves were intact. The barrels sat where you left them. You opened the lid of the nearest one and found potatoes dusted with soil and resignation. You filled your basket carefully, adding a turnip, 2 onions, and something unlabeled that might have been a squash before the frost took an interest. You paused for a moment, staring at the back wall, where a crack had grown since last season. It didn't leak yet, but it was thinking about it. You adjusted a beam, slightly wedged a scrap of cloth into the gap, and made a mental note you wouldn't write down. The return trip was slower. The snow had shifted behind you, reclaiming the path with gentle indifference. You trudged through it, arms heavy with produce, and breath steaming before your face like a signal to any nearby birds that hadn't fled south with better ideas. The house welcomed you with the smell of warmth and something frying. Margaret had found the last of the fat and was using it to make something flat and vaguely celebratory. The children cheered at your return, mostly because it meant fewer vegetables would be assigned for later chores. You set down the basket, flexed your fingers, and moved to the stove where a pan sizzled with the kind of promise only root vegetables and patience could provide. Margaret handed you a spatula. You took it, because soon it would be time to flip the cakes carefully, one at a time, as Margaret supervised from across the stove with the kind of calm authority usually reserved for town judges or territorial cats. They weren't really cakes, not in the birthday sense or the dessert sense or even the pancake sense. They were just grated root vegetables held together by heat stubbornness and a whisper of flour fried flat in a pan, seasoned by years of service, and one unfortunate incident involving soap and a neighbor's visiting cousin. The children gathered around like spectators at a town hall debate, each one eyeing the pan with the thinly veiled desperation of growing appetites and the endless stomachs of wintertime. The first cake went to the youngest, as per tradition. The second was handed to the child who remembered to bring in yesterday's laundry, still frozen in artistic poses on the line. The third cake was handed to you mostly because you were still holding the spatula and had made yourself useful at the shed. Margaret took the fourth for herself, sliced it in half, and passed one piece to the child, who had managed not to argue all morning. That left two small cakes, one lopsided and the other crisped into an abstract shape that vaguely resembled a goose. These were set aside for later disputes or possible bribes. The cakes were eaten quietly, with nods of approval, and the occasional polite cough when someone inhaled a fleck of turnip. There was no talking during root cake breakfast. It was a sacred moment, not because of the flavor, earthy, faintly sweet, and mildly apologetic, but because hot food in winter required concentration. After the last bite was swallowed and the last crumb brushed from the table's edge, the morning resumed. Dishes were collected, water was ladled from the kettle, and washing commenced. The washing bowl, wide and shallow, and slightly cracked at one edge, sat near the stove. It was never empty for long. Margaret filled it with warm water and a dash of lye soap, the kind she made herself from Ash's animal fat and determination. The smell was familiar and oddly comforting, like wet wool and hard work. The washing order rotated daily to prevent arguments. Today, the eldest child started with spoons while the others dried and stacked. You scrubbed the pan not because it was your turn, but because it felt like the right thing to do. The crust came off with some effort, and a flat piece of wood Margaret called the scraper, which had once been a drawer handle, and still bore the faint outline of a keyhole. Once the pan was clean, it was set back on the stove's ledge, upside down, and steaming. The children dispersed one to the front window to draw patterns in the frost, one to the floor, to work on a puzzle that had lost its corners, and one to the fire to warm up a toy made from string and wishful thinking. Margaret began sorting the laundry pile, now half dry and fully crumpled. You returned to your stool and stretched your legs out, feeling the fire soak into your shins, like warm sunlight trapped in iron. Outside, the sky had lightened into that pale, watery blue that promised neither sun nor snow, but rather a sort of waiting. It was too cold to snow easily, which meant the storm had either passed or was taking a break. The wind had gone still again. You could hear the creak of tree branches and the soft scuffle of the chickens in their coop, busy with their endless conversation about seeds and weather. Margaret began humming a tune without words, one she used when counting stitches or kneading dough. You didn't recognize it, but it followed a pattern, 4 soft notes, 1 pause, and a longer hum like a sigh. The laundry line was adjusted. Shirts hung like sleepy ghosts. Socks waited near the fire. A single long John leg draped across the chair back, like a flag of domestic endurance. You rose to stoke, the fire added another small log and stirred the ashes. The coals blinked red, then brightened. The flame responded obediently, like a cat who'd been offered cream. The room warmed just a little more, enough that your fingers relaxed and your shoulders stopped curling in against the cold. Margaret glanced at the woodpile. You noted the look. It meant someone would need to chop more by midday. You nodded and made a mental note that your knees pretended not to hear. The children resumed their game from yesterday, which now involved hiding spoons and rediscovering them with great ceremony. The youngest declared a spoon to be a magic finder of hot stew, which prompted a detailed explanation from the middle child about how magic wasn't real. Only fire was real, and fire couldn't be scooped with spoons. Margaret interrupted this philosophical duel by assigning both of them to fetch snow for the water barrel. They went quietly bundling up and exiting through the back door in a flurry of boots and muffled complaints. You looked around the room. It smelled of soap, tea, wool, and effort. The kind of smell that didn't come from one thing, but from layers of living piled on top of each other, like quilts. You reached for your coat, folded over the chair back, and shook it out. There was still shed straw in the lining, and one of the buttons had disappeared. Again. You debated repairing it. Margaret handed you a tin of buttons without looking. Of course she knew. She always knew. You selected one that almost matched, found the needle stuck into the edge of the curtain, and began threading it with fingers that had forgotten summer. The thread caught on the first try. A rare gift. You sewed slowly the fire at your side, the scent of root cakes lingering like memory. Outside, the children were laughing. Inside, the kettle began to rattle again, demanding another cup of something warm. You tied off the thread, bit the end, and tested the button. It held. For now. Because soon there would be the matter of fence repairs, which had been postponed for 3 days, running, due to snow, wind, and what Margaret described as a general lack of favorable attitude. But the morning light now had that thin, steely quality that hinted at a brief stretch of passable weather, and Margaret had started glancing toward the shed again, with her mouth set in the way that meant chores were no longer negotiable. You tested the newly sewn button on your coat once more, not because you doubted your handiwork, but because there's something about sewing that invites suspicion, especially when done before tea. It held. You pulled the coat around you, tugging gently at the collar, then reached for your gloves. They were damp, not freshly, but with the lingering cool of yesterday's efforts still caught in the seams. You smacked them together, once a half-hearted gesture of encouragement, and slipped them on. Margaret handed you a small sack with nails, a hammer, and 3 pieces of bent wire that might help patch the places where the boards had decided to part ways with the rest of the fence. She also gave you a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, which was not strictly necessary for such a short walk. But she knew as well as you did that fence repair always took longer than expected, especially when done in snow, deeper than your boots, and accompanied by a chorus of distracted chickens. The path to the fence line was mostly packed down thanks to the daily wanderings of animals, children, and the occasional expedition to locate a missing hat. The snow was still knee-deep in places, but the cold had firmed it up into something that barely gave beneath your boots. Your breath floated in front of you, curling upward, like a tiny ghost trying to keep up. The chickens clucked from their coop, which you passed on the way. They watched you with suspicion and vague hope, neither of which were warranted. You had no feed, just wire and a frown. The fence in question ran along the northern edge of the yard, where the land dropped slightly toward a stand of trees that never seemed to lose all their leaves, even in the hardest wind. The boards had been up for 4 winters now, and had done their best. A good fence doesn't complain, just leans quietly until someone remembers to notice. You crouched near the worst section, a gap wide enough for a goat or a particularly motivated child, and pulled the first board upright. The hammer was cold in your hand, but it swung true. The nails found their mark with only minor protest, and you talked to them under your breath as you worked something about staying put and not rusting out until spring. The wire was less cooperative. It had frozen into a shape that resembled a tired pretzel. But you worked it back into something vaguely straight and wrapped it tightly around the loosened slats. Your fingers grew stiff. You flexed them against your coat, blew on them, through the gloves, and kept going. The fence creaked with each adjustment like it had things to say, but had decided to be polite. One board splintered as you nudged it back into place. Not badly, just a corner enough to irritate, but not to halt progress. You shaved it smooth with your knife, a pocket blade dull from years of minor battles, and continued. Birds fluttered above you, little things barely heavier than twigs darting between the trees like thoughts you couldn't catch. You paused and looked up. The sky was a uniform gray, but not threatening, more like the underside of an iron pot left warming above the stove. The wind had stayed away for now. A rare kindness. You finished the last repair and stood back to inspect your work. The fence wasn't proud, but it was standing. That was enough. You leaned on the post at the corner just for a moment and unwrapped the bread from the cloth. It was cold now, but still soft in the middle, and you chewed it slowly, savoring the crunch of crust and the faint sweetness of flour and air. A squirrel watched you from the tree-line tail, twitching clearly, unimpressed by your craftsmanship. You nodded at it anyway. It vanished. The walk back to the house was slower, not out of fatigue, but because the air had taken on that peculiar stillness again, the kind that settled around your shoulders and made every step sound louder. The snow squeaked. Your boots left shallow indentations that would be gone by dusk. You passed the coop again. One of the chickens had escaped and was now pecking aimlessly near the water trough, which had frozen into a glossy disk of regret. You guided her back inside with the practiced movements of someone who knew better than to argue with poultry. The house was warm when you returned, and the children were gathered near the stove, weaving bits of string through a bent hoop in what looked like a new game or a slow-forming invention. Margaret had cleared the table and was slicing the last of the root vegetables into a pot already half filled with broth. You placed the hammer on its shelf, shook the snow from your coat, and leaned in close to the fire. The gloves came off first, then the hat both dropped onto the chair beside you in a heap of moist effort. Margaret looked at you, once eyes flicking to the gloves, then to the stew pot. "Fence?" she asked. You nodded. Mostly. That was enough. She didn't need more. The pot began to steam. You felt it rise, curling toward the ceiling, filling the room with the scent of roots wood and the slow satisfaction of another job finished without incident. Your knees ached again. Your hands stung slightly from the cold, but the fire was steady, and the fence was standing, and the bread had been just enough. The children had begun arguing over the string. Margaret handed you a cup, warm and plain, and you took it, sitting again, boots steaming softly on the hearth. Because before long, there would be talk of getting more bread, or rather, figuring out how to make the next loaf with what was left in the flour tin, which, when tilted, produced a sound not unlike that of a discouraged sigh. Margaret shook it twice, peered inside, and gave the kind of exhale that meant something would have to be stretched, substituted, or imagined. She turned toward you, with her eyebrows doing most of the talking. You sipped your drink slowly and tried not to notice. The stew had begun to bubble in the pot, sending up little puffs of warm, fragrant air that danced in the kitchen's corners like they had nowhere urgent to be. The children, having resolved their string dispute by agreeing it was no longer string, but instead the tail of a snow dragon, were now parading it around the room with careful solemnity. Margaret set the flour tin aside, rubbed her hands on her apron, and opened the pantry door again. It was less a door and more of a curtain now, since the latch had broken during the last freeze and been replaced with a piece of twine and one of your better bootlaces. Inside jars and sacks lined the shelves in various states of half-full contentment. She retrieved a sack of oats and a jar of molasses, both of which had seen better weeks. "We'll make flatbread," she said, not asking. You nodded. Flatbread was acceptable. Not ideal, but then again, the ideal had taken the last train out of town before the snow settled. She set the ingredients on the counter and began measuring with her hand the way she always did when the measuring cup had vanished into whatever alternate dimension claimed useful tools in winter. You offered to stoke the fire again. She nodded, without turning. The log pile was lower than it had been yesterday, which you filed away as another quiet reminder to go back out before sunset. You added a small piece of kindling and a half-split log that had started to show a crack shaped vaguely like the county fair's pie stand. The flame accepted the offering and responded with a renewed warmth that nudged your ankles with appreciation. Then came the shutter. It always came back to the shutter. That one loose board on the front of the house, just beside the window where the frost liked to bloom, had developed a personality over the last 2 winters. It rattled in wind, squeaked in cold, and occasionally gave up entirely and slammed against the siding with the sound of a disapproving judge. And now, as if to mark the precise moment the dough began to take shape under Margaret's hands, it let out a sharp, irregular knock. "You should check," that she said without looking up, "before it pulls the frame." You nodded and stood slowly, the way someone might rise from a hot bath into a room without fear. The coat, still damp along the hem, went back over your shoulders with an audible sigh. You retrieved the small hammer again. Not the one used for fences, but its cousin, the light tapper, the one with the shorter handle and the handle wrap made from part of an old curtain tie. The wind had picked up a little, Not serious, not yet, but enough to carry the snow sideways in little gusts that nipped at your cheeks and made you narrow your eyes like someone trying to read bad news in small print. The shutter, true to form, was rocking back and forth on one hinge, like it had been waiting for an audience. You pressed it gently to the wall, lined up the nail hole with your finger, and knocked it back into place with 3 careful taps. The wood creaked in reply, accepting your authority for now. You stepped back, took in the line of the siding, and saw that the snow on the roof was starting to slide again. You made another note for later. The drip over the porch had turned into a small icicle forest, each one perfectly sharp and perfectly timed to drop into the collar of anyone passing beneath them with too much optimism. You adjusted the path cleared a bit near the door with your boot and headed back inside, where warmth reached for you like a familiar old song. The dough had been flattened and was now cooking on the cast iron pan with the same energy as most winter meals, quiet, persistent, and smelling faintly of endurance. Margaret had already dusted the table and set out a few plates. The children were seated again this time, with spoons ready, and eyes trained on the pan, like it might produce a cake instead of oat bread. You returned the hammer to its hook near the door, a place of honor it shared with the bent ladle and the old corn knife. You peeled off your coat, hung it on the back of your chair, and rubbed your hands together to chase the sting out of your fingers. The bread was flipped once, then again. Margaret slid the first piece onto a plate and passed it to the eldest. It was eaten without comment, which was the highest praise a meal could receive. You were handed the second piece, and you tore it in half, letting the steam rise in thin wisps before dipping it into the corner of the stew that had thickened beautifully. The flavor was earthy, familiar, and a little bitter from the pan. It was perfect. Conversation returned slowly, as it always did, after the first bites, trickling in between chews and spoon clinks. One of the children asked if winter would last forever. Margaret said no, without explaining how she knew. You offered that sometimes it felt like it, but then one day you noticed a drip, or a bird, or a bit of green under the eaves, and that's how you knew it had changed. They nodded like philosophers, considering a new theory, then resumed eating. The shutter stayed quiet. The stew pot emptied slowly. You filled your cup again from the kettle, which had started to boil down into that perfect temperature between sip and scorch. The light outside had begun to shift, not darker yet, just heavier, like the afternoon was preparing to lay down and stretch itself over the hills. Margaret rose to collect the plates, stacking them neatly beside the basin. The children argued gently over who would dry. The wind outside had not gone, just waited. And you knew even as you stood and reached for another log that before long someone would have to talk about taking out the ashes, which was never anyone's favorite, and for good reason. Ashes were light, but they had a way of getting into everything: the air, your sleeves, the creases in your boots, and somehow your mouth, even if you weren't talking. But when the stove had been burning as steady and hungry as it had these past days, the ash box filled up sooner than expected, and once the draft was effected, well, you'd start feeling it in your toes long before you saw it in the flame. So after dinner, plates were wiped, and the kettle refilled after the children were assigned their drying rolls, and Margaret was elbow deep in basin water that steamed like a foggy memory. You found yourself holding the tin ash bucket with its dented lid and blackened handle, balancing it in both hands like a very uncooperative pie. The back door creaked a bit more than usual, which meant the hinge might need oiling soon, but you ignored it for now and stepped out into the gathering hush of pre-evening winter. The sky was still the color of old tin, not quite dark, but leaning that way, and the snow had begun to firm again under the falling temperature, squeaking slightly beneath your boots like polite protest. The usual spot for ash dumping was just past the shed, a shallow pit ringed with rocks and last summer's forgotten fence nails. You walked slowly, not because of the load, but because moving too fast would send up a gray cloud of soot that would settle in your beard and announce your clumsiness for hours. When you reached the spot, you crouched, removed the lid, and tipped the bucket just enough to let the ashes slide out in a gentle cascade. They fell silently, little wisps drifting upward like smoke that had changed its mind. You tapped the bucket once on the rock, replaced the lid, and stood. The wind had returned in the meantime, not a gust, but a presence wrapping around your collar and asking impolite questions about whether your scarf had been tied well enough. It hadn't. You adjusted it, pressed your gloved hand against the back of your neck, and looked up toward the house. The windows glowed dimly, that yellow-orange stove light that always looked warmer from the outside, like a painting of safety more than the thing itself. You took your time walking back, stopping briefly to examine the icicles forming on the corner of the roof. They'd grown longer since yesterday, reaching down like cautious fingers toward the porch rail. One had snapped off and landed in a neat V shape in the snow, where it glittered like a piece of winter glass. You stepped over it and returned the ash bucket to its hook near the door. Inside, the water in the basin had gone cool, and the children had wandered off to various corners, each with a blanket or book or a handful of buttons that might someday become a game. Margaret was wrapping the leftover bread in cloth again this time, humming that same four-note tune, though slightly slower now, like even the melody had started to feel the weight of the day. You removed your coat again, tapping it lightly to shake loose any ash that had found its way onto the sleeves, and set it back on the chair. Then came the question. "Did you check the trap?" she asked, not looking up. You hadn't. You knew it. She knew it. But the trap placed just beneath the pantry wall, where the warmth sometimes drew curious night visitors, had gone untouched for 2 days, and it was now your turn again. "I will you," said, grabbing the lantern before she had to ask. It was already lit, the wick trimmed just low enough to flicker, but not smoke, and you carried it to the pantry like a peace offering. The floor creaked as you stepped over the curtain, and the trap sat there, square and sullen in its corner. You lifted it with one hand gingerly, but it was empty. Not even a whisker of disturbance. You reset it anyway, adjusting the piece of biscuit inside to make it more tempting, and whispered a small apology to no one in particular. Back in the main room, the fire had grown a bit too bold, so you adjusted the damper slightly, watching the flames retreat just enough to behave. The warmth radiated out in soft waves, settling into the floorboards and chair backs and tired feet of the day. Margaret had begun sewing again, something small and precise, a mitten patch, or maybe a sock toe, and the children were murmuring in the half-light, voices low, as if the room itself might be trying to sleep. The stew pot had been moved to the back of the stove to keep warm, and beside it, the kettle now rattled gently, asking to be poured before it boiled itself into nothing. You obliged, filling 2 mugs with water, slightly darker than tea, and handed one to Margaret, who accepted it with the same small nod she'd given you the first winter you'd arrived with a coat too thin and boots 2 sizes too hopeful. You sipped slowly, the heat sinking into your chest, and sat down again, boots stretched out toward the fire, the soles still faintly dusted with ash. The lantern hung from its hook, now casting a soft light over the table where a spoon rested beside a folded napkin, as if someone had forgotten to finish dinner. You didn't move it. The window blanket shifted slightly as the wind tested its stitching again, and from outside came the faint creak of the shed roof settling, or maybe the woodpile sighing under the new weight of dusk. One of the children asked if tomorrow would be a chopping day. You said probably. Margaret said definitely. They groaned in unison, but with less protest than usual, their voices already muffled by the arrival of sleep. You leaned back slightly, balancing your mug on your chest, and listened to the steady rhythm of the stove, the ticking of wood as it expanded and shrank, the rustle of wool and cotton. The small house sounds that meant everything was for now unremarkably fine. And just as your eyes began to blur with the weight of nothing urgent, Margaret quietly asked about the lantern wick, which had begun to burn unevenly again, casting faintly oblong shadows that drifted across the walls like uncertain thoughts. Margaret didn't phrase it as a question. She rarely did when it came to small, fussy things that could easily be ignored, but eventually refused to be. You gave a slow nod, finishing the last of your drink, before setting the mug down with a quiet clink. The lantern swung slightly from its hook, responding to the movement in the room, or perhaps just the whisper of wind brushing past the eaves again, as if the house was exhaling a bit more of its warmth into the night, whether it wanted to or not. The wick trimmer, a bent and blackened piece of tin Margaret kept tucked inside the sewing drawer beneath the spool of coarse gray thread, was still right where it always lived. You retrieved it without fanfare, then stood on the creaky stool to reach the lantern. It took a careful hand and steady breath to remove the globe without sending soot raining down onto the tablecloth, which had already suffered enough indignities this winter. The wick, as suspected, had curled slightly to one side, giving the flame a slant that suggested indecision. You trimmed it cleanly, wiping the blade with the hem of your sleeve, a habit Margaret pretended not to see, and then reassembled the lantern. The flame responded with a gentle straightening its glow, evening out across the room, in a way that suggested minor improvement, though no one commented on it. By then, the children had mostly disappeared under their pile of quilts again, save for the smallest, who was sitting cross-legged near the door, with one boot off and one mitten tucked beneath an armpit, deeply engaged in what appeared to be the quiet unraveling of a sock mystery. "It's the striped one," they said, without prompting. "The one that always goes missing." You glanced at Margaret, who merely raised an eyebrow, as if to say, "Not again." The striped sock, a knitted specimen of uncertain origin and unfortunate elasticity, had indeed developed a reputation over the past weeks for escaping baskets, burrowing into the stove wood, and once appearing beneath the cat like a seat cushion. "Did you check the wash line?" you asked, already knowing the answer. "Blew off," came the reply. "3 days ago. I think it ran." You knelt slowly, knees creaking like floorboards in sympathy, and inspected the area around the child's boots. Nothing. Not even lint. Just the quiet floor and a few errant pine needles from the branch Margaret had insisted on bringing in for New Year's, and which had since become a fixture, shedding politely into corners. "We'll keep an eye out," you said, standing again and brushing off your palms. Socks don't get far in this weather. The child nodded, solemnly, put the boot back on with great effort, and joined the others under the quilt, where discussions resumed in low whispers about dragons, snow, and what stew might taste like if someone ever added cinnamon. Margaret began folding the evening laundry, which had spent the better part of the day draped over every available chair, railing, and curtain rod. Each piece was inspected, shaken, folded, and stacked with the methodical grace of someone who understood the silent satisfaction of well-aligned towels. You offered to help, and were handed a pair of long johns so stretched at the waist they could have passed for an accordion. The two of you folded in companionable silence, the stove popping now and again with contentment as the wind made a brief attempt to push open the chimney flue before giving up with a defeated rattle. Outside, the snow had started falling again, not heavily, but in that slow sideways drift that suggested it had no intention of hurrying. You noticed it first in the way the windows dulled their frost halos, growing thicker around the edges. Margaret caught the direction of your gaze and sighed, not dramatically, but with the gentle resignation of someone whose boots would be needed again tomorrow. "We'll have to check the hens," she said quietly, already knowing the answer. You nodded, reaching for your coat, your scarf, your gloves, in their slightly mismatched state. The chore of checking the hens was part ritual, part responsibility, and part detective work, especially in this weather. They were hardy birds mostly, but not immune to the cold or the curious mischief that came with being cooped up too long. The lantern came with you again, its glass now clear and glowing evenly, casting a modest circle of light as you stepped into the snow. The coop was just beyond the shed, close enough to reach without real complaint, but far enough that each step reminded you how cold had a way of settling deep into your knees the moment you paused too long. The snow crunched beneath your boots in that crisp, satisfying way that meant the top layer had begun to harden. Your breath trailed behind you, long and slow, as if even it were reluctant to keep pace. The coop door creaked open without resistance. Inside, the warmth held barely aided by the straw and the low body heat of clustered hens. Most were asleep heads, tucked, feathers fluffed. A few blinked slowly at your intrusion, indifferent and vaguely offended. You counted them with care. 9, 10, 11. Pause. 12. All present. One had managed to perch atop the feed bin again, a balancing act that never ceased to baffle. You left them a scoop of mash, adjusted the draft board to block the breeze from the west wall, and secured the latch with a bit of twine that had held since last year's thaw. On the way back, the wind had settled. The snow thickened just slightly dusting your shoulders and the edge of your scarf. The house still lit with that soft lantern glow looked exactly as it should, tired, warm, and quiet. You stomped your boots gently on the threshold, re-entered, and set the lantern back on its hook. Margaret glanced up from her sewing. "All there?" she asked. "Everyone," you replied. She nodded, pulling the thread through with a flick of her wrist. The striped sock had yet to reappear, but the house, the fire, the snow, they were all behaving, at least for now. And as the last log of the evening was laid gently into the stove's embrace, Margaret murmured something about mending the patchwork quilt, not the newer one with the blue corner that still held its stitches like polite conversation, but the old one, the one with the green check square that always curled at the edge, and the corner seam that came undone each year like a seasonal ritual. Margaret spoke its name the way you might speak of an old clock that's always just a few minutes behind part affection, part resignation, and entirely familiar. "The edge's gone slack again," she said, holding it up so the light from the lantern cast the frayed thread into high relief. "Feels like it's trying not to be a quilt anymore." You watched her fingers move across the fabric with practiced care, each stitch a small reminder of how many things in the house had held together, not because they were strong, but because someone decided they still needed to. You nodded, then rubbed the back of your neck, where the cold had settled deep after your walk to the henhouse, now tight and twitching just behind the shoulder blade. Margaret offered a warm cloth freshly wrung from the basin, and you draped it over your neck like a peace offering from the stove itself. It helped a little. The children were asleep now, or near enough. The small huddle beneath the quilt pile had gone still, and the only sound from that corner was the occasional shift of a foot or the rustle of a blanket being reclaimed by someone half dreaming of warm soup or snowdrifts that talked. The wind tapped once more at the window, just enough to remind you it hadn't left just curled up beside the chimney for a while. You leaned back and let your eyes trace the curve of the shelf, where the mugs rested the flat surface of the table that still bore the faint rings of hot pots and the memory of last spring's flour spill that had never fully come out. Margaret sewed slow and steady, and somewhere between the 6th and 7th stitch, she said almost to herself, "I wonder what happened to the other curtain tie." You didn't answer. It was one of those questions not really meant for solving, like why the left boot always wore out faster than the right, or how spoons managed to disappear even when nobody had left the house. You'd looked for that curtain tie last fall, turning over drawers and peering under rugs, only to find an acorn, a pencil stub, and something that may have been a part of the sewing machine's history, but no longer matched any of its moving parts. The curtain hung now by its sibling, and a bent nail, which did the job well enough, provided no one pulled too hard. Margaret tied off her thread with a neat knot and smoothed the quilt across her lap. It was whole again for the moment. You rose to check the stove, crouching slightly, to open the lower hatch and stir the coals. The warmth reached your face first. A slow exhale of steady heat that melted the stiffness in your knuckles, just enough to make the task feel more like care than labor. The fire responded well. No sparks, just a mild shift of light and a deepening of the glow that painted the underside of the stove lid with that soft orange that never quite reached the corners of the room. You added one log, maybe two, not too large, choosing the ones with bark flaking off like dried leaves. They caught quickly, and you closed the door, latched it, and stood brushing your hands on your trousers out of habit more than necessity. Margaret had moved to folding now, one corner at a time, her motions deliberate and symmetrical. She placed the mended quilt on the stack near the foot of the children's bedroll, and then turned toward the cupboard, peering in with the faint hope that maybe something she hadn't seen earlier had appeared by now. The cupboard, of course, remained consistent in its contents. 2 jars of jam, both labeled maybe apple, 1 tin of tea leaves that smelled faintly of mint or soap, depending on the weather, and a small box of hard sugar lumps Margaret had been rationing like treasure. She selected one of the jars, opened it, sniffed, and offered it to you with a shrug. You dipped a spoon in and tasted a bit. Definitely apple, or something that had once been near an apple. Sweet, in that way, that winter things were sweet, not so much flavor as memory. Margaret smiled faintly and closed the jar. It would go back on the shelf just in case someone wanted a bit with tomorrow's oatcakes. You stretched again this time, from shoulder to wrist, and walked slowly to the window, lifting the corner of the blanket just enough to see out. Snow. Still falling. Still the kind that didn't seem urgent, just steady, a decision made long ago. The porch rail was nearly buried now, and the path to the shed had softened back into mystery. You let the blanket fall back down and turned. Margaret was unwinding the spool of gray thread, again threading the needle by firelight, without squinting, and you knew she had spotted the loose hem on the child's nightshirt that had been stitched last month in haste. The shirt lay across her lap now, sleeves limp, waiting for its turn. The air in the room had settled into that calm pressure just before true sleep, a space where the stove's ticking filled the silences between movements where the last of the steam had left the kettle and the dishes had dried on their own in the open air. You sat again slowly, and Margaret glanced at you sideways, one eyebrow raised. "You didn't check the wood bin," she said softly, not scolding. "Might need more in by morning." You nodded once, feeling the ache in your thighs, as if your muscles had their own thoughts on the matter. "I'll go in a minute," you murmured, mostly to the fire, which didn't answer. Because you knew that as the hours thinned and the temperature crept toward its lowest point, there would be time still to talk about. How much wood was actually left in the bin? A question that lingered in the air like steam above a lukewarm cup of tea, easily ignored, but only for so long. The moment had arrived, as it always did, sometime after the children's final murmurings faded into sleep, and Margaret's sewing slowed to a rhythm that meant she was no longer stitching out of urgency, but simply to ease her fingers into rest. You stood with a quiet grunt, not from pain exactly, but from that blend of resistance and routine that came with evening chores done in long underwear, and the kind of socks that slid down halfway to your heels. The wood bin sat just inside the back porch, a battered crate reinforced years ago with strips of tin and one stubborn nail that refused to lie flush. Its lid had a handle carved from an old chair rung and always made the same sound when lifted, a sort of creak, crack, pop, like a reluctant confession. You opened it now and peered inside. Not empty, thankfully. A dozen small logs, most of them well-seasoned, some with bark still curling inwards like they'd tried to warm themselves. A few split sticks at the bottom, good for kindling, and one piece shaped like a lazy question mark that nobody wanted to use because it didn't stack right. You took 5 logs, the kind that would burn slow and even, and carried them back to the stove. The room accepted their presence with quiet gratitude, and you stacked them near the hearth with the care of someone preparing a welcome for a tired guest. Margaret had set down her needle, now wrapping what remained of the gray thread around its wooden spool, her thumb keeping the line neat as she turned it slowly. The patched nightshirt had been folded and placed at the foot of the bedding pile. You sat again, letting the warmth seep back into your palms, and glanced toward the small shelf near the window. The one with the box of matches, the dish of buttons, and the tin cup that held stray nails like a sort of rustic bouquet. The shelf was leaning, only slightly. Maybe it had always leaned, or maybe the floor had settled more this year, or maybe one of the children had bumped it during a game involving imaginary forest creatures and a broom. Either way, it was leaning now, and you found yourself watching the matchbox, which sat near the edge, with the poise of someone considering a fall. You stood again, crossed the room, and gently nudged the box toward the center. It scraped softly against the wood, and you lifted it just to check half full. Enough for another week if used sparingly, which you always did. You straightened the matchbox, then picked up the dish of buttons and reorganized it, grouping the like with like dark ones, metal ones, the single green one that matched nothing but had a pleasant weight. Margaret smiled faintly without looking. Fixing the shelf again, she asked, "Not exactly, you said. Just making peace with it." She gave a soft hum that meant she approved, or at least didn't object. The wind had dropped again, outside the silence now, so complete you could hear the stove ticking. The tiny creaks in the ceiling beams, the faint sound of snow slipping off the porch awning in thin sheets. The air in the room had grown thick with comfort, wool, wood smoke, steam, and the faint tang of molasses from the biscuit cloth Margaret had left folded on the back of the stove. You walked to the window, lifting the blanket just enough to peer out again. The snow had deepened now thick along the edges of the sill and curling around the porch posts like it was trying to listen in. The sky remained that low gray, indistinct, and timeless. No moon, just soft, persistent white. Behind you, Margaret stood and began folding the rest of the laundry, the odd sock, 2 towels, and the scarf with the missing tassel. Each item was set neatly into a woven basket, the same one that had served as everything from a cradle to a potato bin over the years. You turned from the window, letting the blanket fall back down, and helped her finish. The last towel was still a little damp, so she draped it over the chair nearest the stove, carefully smoothing the corners like it mattered. You knew it did. Everything mattered in a house where nothing was ever quite extra. You reached for the matchbox again, opened it, and counted the sticks aloud. 17, you said. Margaret nodded. That'll do. You set the box back on the shelf this time, just a little further from the edge, and placed a flat river stone beside it. One of the children had found it in spring and declared it lucky. The shelf leaned, but now it looked like it was choosing to not failing. The lantern had begun to dim, so you trimmed the wick again, turning the glass carefully and catching the faint scent of kerosene in the air. Its light grew stronger for a moment, then settled. You sat once more, stretching your legs toward the stove, and Margaret joined you, her hands resting on her lap. No thread, no task, just stillness. One of the children turned in their sleep and murmured something about ladders and jam. You both smiled, but quietly, because these were the hours for small smiles, for half-finished thoughts, for the creaking rhythm of a house that had learned how to carry the weight of time. You looked at Margaret, who now rested her head against the back of the chair, eyes half closed, and just as your own lids began to drift down, you remembered that someone still needed to mention the morning fire, the humble ritual that would begin again before dawn and insist on its place in the day, whether you were ready or not. You knew that the first log added wasn't just fuel. It was a signal, a soft announcement that the world was waking slowly, that winter was still in command, and that warmth, like patience, must be coaxed rather than demanded. You reached toward the stove's side and lifted the latch, the metal cool but responsive under your fingers. The embers glowed faintly beneath the ash, stubborn hearts still beating with the memory of last night's blaze. You poked gently, sending a shower of sparks upward, before adding the smallest kindling you could find, careful not to smother the fragile warmth. The flame flickered, surprised, then stretched lazily, reaching out like a sleepy cat for the new wood. You closed the door, hearing the soft whoosh of air feeding the fire, and settled back on the bench. Outside, the darkness was still deep, the world wrapped in a quiet blanket of snow that muffled all but the softest sounds. You could hear the distant call of a crow, lonely and determined, and the faint creak of ice shifting somewhere beyond the fence line. The wind for the moment held its breath, as if waiting to see what the day might bring. Margaret stirred softly in her bedroll, the patchwork quilt drawn up to her chin, and you could see the faint rise and fall of her breath in the firelight. The children were still asleep, huddled together like small animals seeking shared warmth. And you watched them with the kind of fondness that made your heart ache softly, a gentle rhythm beneath the cold. The kettle, already warmed by residual heat, let out a soft whistle that broke the silence like a whispered reminder. You rose slowly, stretching your stiff limbs, and crossed to the stove to pour the steaming water into the waiting teapot. The tea was weak, but hot, a comfort in a cup, and you cradled it between your hands, letting the warmth seep in. Margaret shifted, then opening her eyes to the faint light and the promise of another day. You offered her a cup without words, and she accepted it with a soft smile, her fingers brushing yours briefly in that quiet way that spoke of shared endurance. The children began to stir first with small noises, murmurs, stretches, the soft shuffle of limbs against quilts, and soon, with whispered complaints about cold toes and missing mittens, you laughed quietly, an agreement and a surrender, and began the slow, familiar process of waking the household. Breakfast would be simple again. Oatcakes thin and crisp, warmed by the stove, and the last of the root stew thickened overnight into something hearty and kind. There would be no hurry, no urgency beyond the necessities of warmth and light, and you knew that the day's chores awaited with their usual quiet insistence. The barn roof needed checking again, as did the fence line, and someone would have to brave the cold once more to haul water from the well before it froze solid again. But for now, in this fragile dawn, there was a moment to be savored, a soft beginning wrapped in wool and steam, the slow unspooling of time beneath the watchful eye of winter. You sipped your tea, watching the fire catch and leap as you added another small log, and thought of the coming hours with a kind of resigned affection. Because surviving the brutal cold in the Wild West wasn't about grand gestures or heroic escapes. It was about the small things, the patching of quilts, the drying of socks, the counting of hens, the slow dance of fire and ash. It was about finding warmth in routine and comfort in the unremarkable. And as the light outside began to shift from the deepest night to the palest gray, you knew that this quiet rhythm, this deliberate, slow march through cold and snow and small daily victories was the true story of winter survival. One humble log at a time. And so you prepared to rise fully, to greet the day with the steady hands and patient heart it required, knowing that soon enough the stove would need more attention as it always did. The fire wasn't just a source of warmth. It was a quiet companion, a constant presence that shaped the rhythm of your days and marked the passing of hours with its soft crackles and pops. You added another log, smaller, this time one that had been patiently waiting in the bin, its bark flaking slightly like a forgotten letter. The flame welcomed it with a soft flicker, as if pleased by the company and the promise of longevity. Margaret stirred from her seat near the window, where she'd been watching the slow dance of snowflakes against the glass. Her eyes, bright despite the early hour, met yours, and she offered a small smile that spoke of shared endurance and the comforting familiarity of routine. The children had gathered now, their limbs stretching awkwardly as they emerged from their nests of quilts and blankets. The youngest had a sock missing again, a mystery that was becoming part of the household lore. Margaret sighed, but said nothing, knowing that the sock would turn up, eventually, most likely in the woodpile or behind the stove. Breakfast was simple and quiet. You handed out pieces of warmed oat cake and bowls of stew thickened overnight. The children ate with a kind of reverence reserved for hot food in cold weather, their hands wrapped around bowls like tiny shields against the chill. After the meal, the fire needed tending again, and so you took up the familiar ritual, stirring the embers, adding kindling, coaxing the flame back to steady life. Outside, the snow had softened under a thin layer of new flakes, the wind low and thoughtful, rather than sharp and accusing. The sky was a pale wash of gray, the kind that made colors dull and shadows disappear, flattening the world into quiet sameness. The day's chores awaited more wood splitting, fence patching, checking on the hens, and hauling water before the sun could thaw the frozen well. But for now, there was time to pause to sip tea that was finally strong enough to keep the chill at bay, and to watch the firelight ripple across the walls like a gentle tide. Margaret began mending another piece of clothing, a sweater with a hole just large enough to make wearing it a gamble. The children resumed their quiet games, weaving stories and shadows in the corner, their voices low and conspiratorial. You took a moment to check the kindling box, ensuring it was ready for the evening, and found the last few sticks neatly arranged, waiting like small soldiers. The room smelled of wood smoke, dry wool, and the faint sweetness of molasses from the morning's tea. It was a scent that spoke of survival, of persistence, of days that rolled gently into nights, and then into more days. You felt the ache in your knees again, a reminder of yesterday's work and the inevitable tasks ahead. But you also felt something softer, a kind of peace that came from knowing that you had done enough for now that the house was warm and that those you cared for were safe and fed. The light outside shifted subtly as afternoon edged toward evening, and the wind began to pick up again, whispering through the trees with a new urgency. You glanced toward the window, watching the first long shadows stretch across the snow-covered yard. Margaret stood folding the mended sweater with care and handed it to one of the children, who accepted it with a shy smile. The stove crackled, demanding attention, and you rose once more, preparing to feed it again, to keep its heart beating through the growing cold. You reached for the wood bin, knowing the night would be long and the fire would need steady hands. The children gathered near the table, their eyes heavy, but their minds still dancing with the stories they'd spun earlier. Margaret settled beside you, her hand finding yours in a quiet gesture that needed no words. And as the light dimmed and the first stars blinked awake in the cold sky, You knew that tomorrow would bring more of the same, the slow, steady fight against cold and dark, the patient tending of fire and family, the gentle persistence of life in a world carved from snow and wood. Because that is how you survived the brutal cold in the Wild West, one careful step, one warming flame, one quiet moment at a time. And as the night deepened and the stove whispered its steady song, you settled back into the rhythm, ready for whatever the dark hours might bring, knowing that soon you would have to tend the fire once more. Night had deepened, now settling over the cabin like a heavy quilt, thick and quiet. The world outside had lost its shape, reduced to gentle hums and whispers carried by the wind. The stove's soft glow was the only steadfast presence, casting flickering shadows that played like sleepy spirits along the walls. You sat in your usual spot chair, creaking slightly beneath you, the quilt draped over your lap like a soft, familiar weight. Margaret had already retreated to her bedroll, her breathing steady, a quiet rhythm that matched the fire's pulse. The children, too, had succumbed to sleep, their occasional murmurs and shifting limbs the only evidence of life in the hushed room. The fire needed care, as it always did, though tonight more gentle than urgent. You added a small piece of kindling. The flame flickered up, brightening momentarily, before settling into its comforting murmur. The warmth seeped into the floorboards, the furniture, the very air turning the cabin into a cocoon against the biting cold beyond the walls. You listened to the house, breathing the soft creaks and groans that told stories of years weathered and winters survived. It was a sound you had come to know intimately, a companion as constant as the firelight. Outside, the wind shifted, a low moan rising, then falling like the sigh of a restless giant. Snowflakes drifted lazily against the window panes, tracing delicate patterns that melted upon contact with the warm glass. The night was still, but alive with quiet movement, the subtle dance of cold and warmth playing out beyond the fragile barrier of your home. You reached for the lantern, adjusting the wick just enough to steady the light, casting a steady pool of golden glow that softened the edges of the room. The cat stirred in her basket, stretching and curling back into sleep, her purring a gentle hum that blended with the fire's whisper. Your thoughts drifted as you sat there, tracing the worn edges of the chair arms with your fingers, feeling the grain of the wood smooth from years of use and quiet hands. The ache in your knees was dull now, replaced by a calm fatigue that seemed to seep into your bones, matching the steady beat of the stove. You thought of the coming morning, of the endless cycle of fire and wood water, and warmth food, and quiet labor. It was a rhythm, both comforting and relentless, a slow, steady dance that held you and your family through the harshest nights. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly, its voice carrying over the snow, like a lullaby meant only for those awake and listening. You smiled faintly, a small gesture in the dark. The wind shifted again, more playful this time, rattling the shutters in a gentle percussion that reminded you the night was alive and watching. You added another small log, careful not to let the flames leap too high, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace. The fire responded with a steady glow, casting warmth and light in equal measure. You settled back, wrapping the quilt tighter, your eyes heavy, but not fully closed. The house held its breath with you. The world paused in the soft space between wakefulness and sleep. The night stretched on slow and deep, the fire's song a constant lullaby. And as the shadows danced quietly and the cold whispered outside, you knew that soon enough dawn would come again, bringing the steady return of chores and warmth, routine and care. Because that was how life was lived here. One careful breath, one warm flame, one quiet moment at a time. And as the night deepened still, with the stove's glow painting the room in soft gold, you drifted closer to sleep, knowing that soon you would have to. The first stirrings of dawn, slow, low, and careful, like a shy visitor peeking through frosted window panes to see if the world was ready to wake. The night's shadows retreated quietly, melting into the pale gray light that crept in soft and deliberate across the snow-covered yard. The stove's glow dimmed slightly in the presence of the growing day, but it did not surrender warmth or comfort. Instead, it held steady, a steadfast anchor in the shifting light. You woke slowly, the weight of sleep lingering in your limbs, wrapped in the quilt's familiar embrace. The ache in your knees and shoulders was softened by the promise of heat and routine. You listened for the sounds that marked the beginning of the household's day, the soft breath of the children, the gentle footsteps of Margaret stirring beneath her, covers the creak of the old floorboards as someone moved carefully toward the kitchen. The fire needed tending again, as it always did, its embers glowing softly beneath the ash, waiting patiently for your touch. You rose and added the smallest kindling, coaxing the flame to life, watching the light spread in warm waves through the room. The air was still cool, but held the faint scent of wood smoke and stew. a comforting reminder of the night's efforts and the day ahead. Outside, the sky was a pale wash of color, the sun not yet visible, but promising its presence with a gentle, steady increase in light. Snowflakes drifted slowly, settling softly on the porch and windowsills, turning the world outside into a quiet, white canvas. You moved to the window, lifting the edge of the blanket just enough to peer out, tracing the soft outlines of trees and fences etched in frost. The porch was glazed with ice, and the path to the well was nearly buried, again a reminder of the relentless hold winter had on the land. Margaret appeared beside you, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, her eyes bright with the quiet determination of someone who had faced many mornings just like this. You shared a small smile, a wordless greeting that spoke of shared history and endurance. The children were beginning to wake, their murmurs and rustlings growing louder as they emerged from their nests of blankets. Breakfast preparations would begin soon. The reheating of stew, the warming of oatcakes, the careful stirring of tea that was always too weak, but always enough. You glanced toward the stove, its fire now dancing higher, filling the room with heat and light. The day's tasks awaited, steady and certain chopping wood to restock the bin, checking on the animals to ensure their comfort, repairing the fence where winter's weight had tested its strength, hauling water from the well before the cold could claim it again. But for now, in this soft moment of dawn, there was still time to breathe, to savor the calm before the quiet busyness took hold. You sat again, pulling the quilt close, feeling the warmth seep into your bones, and allowed your thoughts to wander gently. You thought of the long hours ahead, of the small victories and minor frustrations that shaped each day in this frozen landscape. You thought of the stove's steady glow, the patchwork quilts, the missing socks, and the countless routines that kept life moving forward. Outside, the wind whispered softly, a gentle reminder that winter was still here, that the cold had not yet loosened its grip, but also that life in its slow, persistent way continued. You sipped the warming tea, the steam rising in thin spirals, and watched as the first light filled the room more fully. Margaret began to move quietly and efficiently, preparing the day's first meals and tending to the children as they fully woke. The house stirred with life. Small sounds and gentle movements weaving together into the fabric of a new day. And as you settled into the rhythm, once more ready to face the cold and the chores, you knew that soon enough the fire would call again. The logs would crackle, and the quiet, steady story of survival in the Wild West would continue, one small moment, one warm flame, one slow step at a time. And so you rested briefly, gathering strength for the tasks ahead, knowing that the cycle would repeat and that tomorrow would bring the endless cycle to begin anew as it always did. This rhythm, the slow, measured breathing of winter life, was as familiar as the rough-hewn walls of the cabin and as steady as the flicker of the stove's flame. You rose fully now, the quilt slipping from your shoulders, like a well-worn friend, reluctant to let go. The children had gathered, their cheeks flushed with the soft pink that cold brings their eyes, bright with the kind of restless energy that only a night of dreams and a morning of warmth can coax forth. Margaret moved with quiet efficiency, setting out the simple breakfast oatcakes, toasted just enough stew, warmed to a perfect simmer, tea poured into chipped cups that bore the marks of countless mornings. The table, scarred and steady, held these humble offerings with grace, a stage for the daily performance of survival and care. You sat once more, feeling the heat from the stove seep into your boots, warming toes that had braved the cold long before dawn. Outside, the snow continued its quiet fall, a slow dance that softened the hard edges of the world and wrapped the land in white patience. The chores of the day loomed, but felt less like burdens and more like necessary rituals. Wood to chop water, to carry fences, to mend all threads woven into the fabric of existence here. You watched as Margaret handed out food, her hands steady, her gaze soft, but resolute. The children ate in companionable silence, the warmth in their bowls, a small victory against the relentless cold. The fire demanded attention, as it always did, and you answered, feeding it steadily, watching the flames respond with gentle light and comforting heat. The room seemed to breathe, with you alive, with the sounds of quiet life, the scrape of chair legs, the soft murmur of voices, the distant call of a winter bird. Time stretched and folded in the slow unfolding of the day, marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the shifting light and the fire's steady song. You thought of the days behind and the days ahead, of the small, persistent victories that made survival not just possible, but bearable, even hopeful. The stove's glow deepened as afternoon settled in, casting long shadows that stretched lazily across the floor. You leaned back, letting the warmth fill the spaces between your bones, a soft comfort against the cold that would return with night. Margaret began tending the stew again, stirring slowly, adding water from the kettle, coaxing flavors from root vegetables, that had seen many seasons. The children played quietly nearby their games, simple but full of imagination. A world within a room, a fortress of blankets, a kingdom of small hands and laughter. You smiled, feeling the weight of exhaustion and contentment. In equal measure, the tiredness that comes from days lived with purpose and patience. The evening would come soon, bringing the need to prepare the fire once more, to ready the house for another long night wrapped in quilts and quiet whispers. But for now, there was still time to sit, to watch the flames dance, to listen to the steady rhythm of life in this remote, snowbound corner of the world. Because in the end, survival in the brutal cold of the Wild West was not about grand gestures or sudden heroics. It was about these moments, small, steady, often unnoticed, the careful tending of fire and family, the soft turning of the days, the quiet endurance that wove warmth into the fabric of life. And as the night settled around the cabin, once again, and the stove sang its low, steady song, you knew that this story would continue, gently and without end, a slow and comforting testament to the simple strength of routine and the enduring power of hope. So now, dear listener, you may close your eyes, drift softly into dreams warmed by the glow of long-ago fires, and rest in the quiet knowledge that tomorrow will bring another day, another flame, and another chance to survive the cold with gentle patience and quiet grace.